So, this most recent episode of Severance, season 2, episode 7, was incredible. I know that is not a hot take, but it was genuinely one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen on a screen. The director was their typical cinematographer, Jessica Lagrange, I believe is her name. This was the first thing that she has ever directed. It was just incredible. I hope she directs more things in the future. She has to. I mean, I'm sure her phone is blowing up right now and she deserves it. Absolutely incredible work. All the incredible transitions she did, because this episode was jumping around so much in space and in time and in perspective. Just incredible, groundbreaking. I mean, just incredible, groundbreaking. Also, amazing work from Deechan Lockman as Gemma. She is an incredible actress, and I'm glad she is finally able to act instead of just showing up and looking beautiful for 2 seconds. I can't even think of any words. Very good. Great episode of television. I loved it. This was obviously a huge episode for building on the show's mythology and the overarching plot and what is Lumen actually doing. I am still confused a bit, but I thought that it would be good to go over what exactly we know and what they have shown us about the Severance program, about the chips, and about what MDR is actually doing. The facts are these. We know that Severance chips have been around for about 25, 30 years maybe. We know this because in the gala at the end of the first season, Helly's father, James Egan, was talking to her and telling her about the time that he showed her the original prototype for the chip when she was a child. And if Helena is supposed to be in her 30s, that means that these chips have at least existed for a couple decades. And we know that the first severed office opened up 12 years ago. We heard this at the dinner party with Bert and Fields and Irving. Now, it is possible that Lumen was using this technology before then. As we said, the chips have been around for maybe 20, 30 years, but it did not become public until about 12 years ago. We know that MDR as a department has been around for at least several years. Irving had been there for 3 years, but there also are those larger rumors around the other severed employees about them having pouches and stuff. It's clear that this is a long-standing department that has a reputation. We also know that there are multiple MDR departments all over the country and all over the world. We know that Gemma and Mark have both been there for around 2 years now, and we know that Gemma was recruited by Lumen because we saw her with those cards with the guys fighting each other or fighting themselves on them, which are the same cards that Dylan saw in O&D towards the end of season 1, and the card that he hid behind the toilet, and that was why Milchick woke him up at his house. So we know that those cards come from Lumen, and they just sent them to her for some reason. So it seems those cards are some kind of a recruiting tool that Lumen uses to find test subjects for this ultra secret project. And we know that they were likely recruited from the fertility clinic that they went to because we saw that creepy doctor in the background there. But it is possible that Lumen has had its eye on them for much longer. We see that they met initially at a Lumen blood drive. They live in Kier, which is the town of Lumen headquarters. And I think it is very likely that Mark was recruited as well as Gemma. There might have been an intention to get a refiner and a test subject who have a strong relationship to each other. They know that they need Mark specifically to finish the Cold Harbor project. And I think it is safe to say that we now know that the chips can do more than just Severance. We saw in this episode that Gemma has multiple innies. It also does seem like they can potentially make you see things almost like a VR situation. I talked about this when I was talking about episode 4 and how I thought that the MDR team doubles there were not actually real, that they were some kind of a projection of these chips. In this episode, I do think bears through on that idea. First and foremost, because of the airplane scene we saw Gemma in this episode. That airplane was pitching and shaking, and there is no way that that was actually happening. in a tiny room underground. I think that some of the rooms are real rooms. I think that some of the rooms are real rooms, like that dentist room, because we saw the doctor collecting those dental tools from OND, and afterwards Gemma's mouth hurt, so they clearly did actually do something to her physical body. And we know that all of these rooms have names that correspond with various files that MDR has been refining, and I do think that they are all finished files. Allentown, the room where she had to write all of those thank you notes, is the file that Mark got his little class head thingy that's on his desk. We also know that Gemma has not yet been sent into the Cold Harbor room, and that is the name of the big file, the important thing that Mark is doing that will supposedly change the world and usher in a whole new era of humanity. We know that the MDR process involves scrolling through this big matrix of numbers and finding numbers that are either scary, sad, angry, or happy, and then sorting them into various bins. And the bins have to be filled equally up to a certain amount before the file is considered fully refined. We do hear in the first season that the files often expire before they can finish refining them. I think that they said they finished maybe 1 in 5 files. And in the 3 rooms that we saw Gemma enter in this episode, she was put in stressful, often physically painful situations. Now, we only saw 3 and there are dozens of them. Maybe some of the rooms are happy rooms, but from what we saw, she's not having a good time in them. And we know that those 4 buckets correspond to Kier Egan's 4 tempers: woe, frolic, dread, and malice, that he believed were crucial to the makeup of an individual human psyche. We know that Lumen's view of individual mental health on the outside also centers around the 4 tempers. After Helena has the traumatic experience of almost being drowned, she goes through some sort of a procedure to rebalance her tempers. They mention something called an obligement session, which is definitely not creepy or culty at all. So Lumen believes that traumatic incidents like that unbalance your tempers and put you in a psychologically bad place, and in order to fix that, you have to rebalance those 4 tempers. We also know that there are potential other uses for severance technology in the outside for rich people. We saw the pregnant lady at the birthing retreat who didn't remember meeting Devin. So it seems that there is some sort of a severance-esque procedure so people can avoid the pain and trauma of childbirth. Although in this episode, when Devin brings that up to Dr. Ragabe, she does say that that is a different thing. So maybe that doesn't work exactly the same as the severance procedure that is given to Lumen employees. The overall goal of the MDR project and the Cold Harbor file is still unclear. It seems to have something to do, though, with removing trauma, with preventing people from remembering traumatic experiences. Jaime Egan at that gala at the end of the first season also talked about how soon everyone will have a severance chip and they will all be Kier's children. He also mentioned something called a revolving. He told Helena that someday you will sit next to me at my revolving. We don't exactly know what that means. And in this episode, when Gemma asks the doctor about Cold Harbor, he basically says something vague about how it will take away Mark's pain the same way that Kier has taken away Gemma's pain. So it seems that the overall goal of this project does likely have something to do with removing traumatic experiences. And the implications of having an innie self that only experiences trauma are horrifying. Definitely not any sinister things that a mega corporation could do with that technology. I think it's fine. Now, going back to what these chips could possibly be doing, I do think that there is a chance that they are recording data in the brains of severed individuals, potentially of their memories and experiences, even outside of the severed floor. It seems unlikely that these are Gemma's memories specifically because of the period clothing that she is wearing in them. The letter writing one seemed like it was several decades ago. She's wearing 80s wigs. She's wearing that 80s wig on the plane, and I don't know exactly what era that red robe is from, but it looks like it was from probably before Gemma was even born. Now, it is worth noting that the fact that Gemma does not like writing thank you notes was brought up specifically by Mark in this episode, so it does seem possible that that is an experience that is particularly tailored to her set of dislikes. So I think it is very possible that severance chips are collecting data from the brains of severed individuals, and that that is part of the data that MDR teams are refining. Now, we see in this episode that underneath the MDR team on the testing floor, there is a sort of shadow MDR team who look like they could be the actors' stand-ins. They might actually be the stand-ins. Now that I think about it, that would be very convenient. They already have 4 people who kind of look like these people. But we see that each person's double is watching a feed of their face and also what is going on their screen. And then they have a little thing of 4 buttons, and they sometimes press buttons. We also see that the Mark double is looking at what appears to be a live feed from one of Gemma's brain scans. Now, one thing that I am curious about is why exactly they had Gemma be the wellness counselor for the entire severed floor. It's clearly not just they're testing to see if she and Mark remember each other, because we know that she also visited the mammalians, nurturables, goat people. She presumably works with the entire floor. It seems possible that those wellness sessions have something to do with the gathering of data from the severance chips, if that is in fact what they're doing. Now, there is a supplemental text called the Lexington Letter that you can find online. I recommend reading it if you are interested in the show. It's a pretty quick read, and it has a lot of interesting implications for the mythology and what MDR teams are actually doing. Basically, the Lexington Letter is an email that was sent to a journalist by a former Lumen employee named Peg Kincaid. Now, Peg had a severed job at a Lumen office, and there is an implication in the letter that Lumen may have been listening to her, complaining about her job, and potentially recruited her and targeted advertisements specifically at her. So Peg takes a job at a severed office. Everything is seemingly going fine from her perspective. Then one day she comes out of work and she finds a note in her pocket. And this note is written in this secret language that she developed with her sister as a child, that is basically a series of pictograms that was somehow able to evade the Lumen code detectors in the elevators. So Peg and her innie, Peggy K, start communicating and writing notes to each other back and forth. And Peg finds out that her innie works in an MDR department and does this thing with numbers that are scary. Then one day, Peg finds a note from her innie where she talks about how she just finished this big file called Lexington that was super difficult and took her a bunch of weeks to do, and she felt really good about it, and she was really excited, and she finished it at 2:30 that afternoon. Then Peg hears on the news about this horrible truck explosion that killed a bunch of people that happened at 2:32, so 2 minutes after her innie completed the file. And this truck belonged to a rival company of Lumen. So she starts to suspect that the Lexington file and its completion had something to do with this explosion. And she writes a note into Peggy telling her about it and asking her, do you think that this could be connected? And then one day she comes to in the elevator and her hair is wet, and there is a note in her pocket from Peggy that says, I think that you're right about this Lexington truck explosion situation. I've been in the break room for several days. The code detectors are down now, so I'm able to get this note through to you. But I think that you're correct about what Lumen is doing, and you should try to get away as quickly as possible because they're on to you. So Peg obviously quits her job as Lumen. She tries to leave town, and she sends this email to the journalist. And then there is another email that's a news clip talking about how Peg Kincaid was recently found dead. No foul play suspected, probably just fine, don't worry about it. So what the Lexington Letter indicates is that the completion of MDR files does affect events in the real world. We don't know exactly how it affects them. I don't know if it's activating a sleeper agent or a secret second thing. And one more thing on the theory front, I clearly don't know exactly what is going on, but it's not cloning. I'm going to say that definitively. I have never thought that it was cloning. I think that cloning is just a completely different set of technologies than what we have been presented with so far. Seems clear that Lumen maybe has extra abilities to manipulate the human mind, but doing that and growing an entirely new human body and then aging it up to adulthood is a totally different thing. I do not think that anyone on this show is a clone. I think the idea that they are maybe trying to resurrect Kier Egan or some dead Egans in some fashion is an interesting one that has merit, but I think if they are doing that, it will be resurrecting their mind somehow and then putting it into someone else's body. And I'm not convinced that that is actually what the goal is here. I also remembered in the first season, after Petey's death, Miss Cobell went through that whole ordeal of drilling into his head at his own funeral in order to get his chip back, and that might have just been because they thought he had possibly been reintegrated and they didn't want that to get out. But when she brought it back, she basically put the chip down on the table and said, "This is PD." So that indicates that maybe the chips have some sort of capacity to store memories and store some sort of an essence of a person. But going back to this episode specifically, I will say the one thing that maybe kind of confused me, didn't quite work for me, I didn't quite understand, is why Devin would want to call Miss Cobell. Now, don't get me wrong, I was not questioning the logic of this while I was watching the episode, because I was like, yes, you should call her, you should bring her back. What has she been up to? Where is she? I'm not sure that decision fully tracked for me. I mean, we know that Devin is in a desperate position, and she also just got confirmation that Gemma is still alive, and we know and we saw in this episode that Gemma was also a very close friend of hers too. So I think she is, like Mark, willing to go to extreme lengths to get her friend back. But I also don't see why she would trust Miss Cobell at all. That's just such a huge, huge, massive risk. What are they gonna do to Mark if they find out that he's reintegrated? I mean, they probably would kill him. And we do get confirmation in this episode that Miss Cobell was in fact raised by Lumen, because it's definitely not a cult. I also wanted to shout out the actress who plays Dr. Rakabe. I think she has been fantastic. There is a mad scientist quality to her, but there is this sort of level of sincerity and sadness when she speaks. I really would love to hear more about her story. We know that she did work for Lumen. She said she was the person who installed Mark's Severance chip, so we know that she was working with them at least as much 2 years ago. What was it that made her quit working for Lumen and start working against them? Was it a moral issue where she couldn't stand what she was doing on an ethical level? Or was it something more personal? Did it have anything to do with Gemma? It does seem like she knew Gemma in some capacity, the way that she is talking about her. And given that we did see she had something set up at the college where Gemma and Mark used to teach, they might have known each other somehow. There is also the question of what Mark is going to be like now, having woken up from his memory coma thing. Is he now fully reintegrated? Dr. Ragabe did seem to want to keep doing treatments on him, although obviously she has now left. So I don't know if he is fully integrated. We didn't actually hear him say anything when he woke up from wherever he was, so it is possible that there could be some kind of an issue with his brain, although he does have to complete Cold Harbor. I just think narratively they have been putting this in front of us the whole season. We have to see it to completion. So I don't think that any Mark is completely gone or he will be completely unable to do his work from now on, but he might be now permanently altered in a way. He might be closer to fully integrated, even if he is not completely there. This episode was just emotionally devastating Once again, I think Deacon Lockman did such a good job bringing life to Gemma as a character and really getting the audience to care about her in such a small amount of time. Knowing that the real Gemma is still down there and that she is fighting tooth and nail to get out is a different type of heartbreaking. The whole dead wife montage set to French music I think would have been incredibly corny in less capable hands, but here it was beautiful. I was tearing up this entire episode. It made me feel things. Did you know that television can make you feel things? I had kind of thought that it was going to be that Gemma was no longer really herself, that something of her was missing, and that Mark would never actually truly be able to get back the woman he fell in love with, but I am less sure of that now. I mean, obviously, we know that Gemma, who is down on the testing floor, is the real Gemma. But it also seems like Lumen is never going to let her leave. And there is the question about Gemma as to whether or not she volunteered for this project. I think even if she did volunteer, she did not know the scope of it or how long she would be gone. The scene where we saw her leaving the night she died, it didn't necessarily seem like she knew that she was leaving for anything other than a game of charades. I would love to know more about what exactly they told her at the onset, if there was some sort of break room type thing. Gemma does not seem like the person who would just acquiesce to that kind of a thing. So there's probably something very sinister that happened there. Now, I am not an expert on Buddhist philosophy or Russian literature, so please forgive me if I'm being completely obtuse here, but I did want to talk about the concept of Chikhai Bardo, the name of this episode, as well as Leo Tolstoy's The Death of Ivan Ilyich, which was mentioned a couple times during the episode. Gemma is grading a paper about it when she first meets Mark, and that is the book that the doctor is looking at when she smashes him on the head with a chair. A bardo in Buddhist teachings is a sort of liminal space between life and death, or between life and the next life. And the Chikhai bardo specifically refers to the moment of death, or the moments leading immediately up to death. Now, in this episode, Gemma refers to this in a non-literal capacity. She talks about it as a sort of ego death. And this is the subject of the test that Lumen sends out to recruit test subjects for this program. Perhaps they are looking for someone who is capable of mastering their own psyche in that way and separating themselves from themselves. They are letting Gemma have some relics of her past life. They let her have books. They let her have music, but she is in this isolated place where she spends most of her time, in some ways, being other people. Now, The Death of Ivan Ilyich is a novella by Leo Tolstoy that is about exactly what it sounds like. Ivan Ilyich is a man who believes that he has lived a good and reasonable life. He has always done what he feels he is supposed to. He married the woman that he thought the people around him wanted to marry. He went to school because his parents expected him to go to school. And then one day he injures himself while hanging some curtains, and the symptoms from that injury slowly grow worse and worse until he knows that he is dying. In the last few weeks of his life, he is in so much pain that he can't really do anything. And so he is contemplating his life and what is all this pain and suffering for. And he can't allow himself to believe that the life he lived was actually not a good life until the very end. He hasn't lived an exceptional life, but he has lived what would be considered to be a fairly desirable one for an upper middle class Russian man of his era. He married the woman that he thought that he should marry based on social status, and they don't have a great relationship, but they get along decently most of the time. He has a good and steady job as a lawyer, maybe some struggles with money here and there, but he is able to land on his feet and provide for his family in the way he believes he should. The story mentions how he detaches himself from situations he feels to be stressful or uncomfortable, such as arguments with his wife. He does his job ably and capably, but he has no true passion for it. There actually is a passage about how good Ivan Ilyich is at separating his work life from his personal life. And at the end of his life, comprehending his mortality, he comes to the conclusion that this life was empty, that it was no real life, that he was not being his authentic self because he was just constantly doing what he believed society wanted him to do, what he believed he was supposed to do. Now, the life that Ivan Ilyich leaves is the sort of life that I think that Lumen would consider ideal, that they would try to sell to people. You do your job and you keep the system rolling. You buy a nice house that looks like everyone else's nice house. You live a competent and reasonable life within certain margins, avoiding significant trauma or significant risk. And that life is ultimately empty and unfulfilling. I'm sure we all have experiences that we wish that we could sever, that we wish we never went through. And I am not trying to say that actually trauma is good because it makes you stronger and a good person. But it is a part of life, and when you try to excise everything that is distressing, you end up with something flat and empty. What Lumen is trying to sell is the fundamental loss of anything that is meaningfully human. Even if you ignore the horrific idea of creating a version of yourself that only experience even if you ignore the horrific idea of creating a version of yourself that only experiences trauma and pain, what you are left with is something that is flat and empty. And trying to avoid trauma is a central theme of this show. It's why Mark took the severed job in the first place. But avoiding it or even shunting it off to a different part of yourself does not actually make it go away. When Mark is talking to PD in the first season, he tells him about how he got this job because he lost his wife and he was horrifically sad about it, and he wanted a version of himself that wouldn't have to feel that pain. But PD says, no, I think you were actually feeling it the whole time. You just didn't know what it was. There was always something about you that was just sad. You would come in and your eyes would be red. Cutting off parts of yourself is only ever a coping mechanism. It doesn't actually solve any of the underlying problems. Now, this term could refer to what either Mark or Gemma is going through in this episode. Mark, more literally perhaps, he is on the verge of death. And it's unclear whose memories these are exactly, if it is some sort of a shared consciousness, if it is a little bit of both of theirs. Yeah, this show is incredible. I can't wait for more, but also I don't want it to be over. I really hope there is not another 3-year wait in between seasons 2 and 3. I don't know if I can make it. I might have to get severed myself so I don't have to wait for the next season of Severance. And then that other version of me can just figure out my life for me.